Now the groove that I'm trying to fit in here is 1/8 of an inch. That's normally because I like to use 1/8 of an inch saw blade when I do it. This is the material I was thinking about using. It's a piece of walnut, and the color contrast will look pretty nice. So the idea is to try and cut an 1/8 inch strip of this and make sure that it's perfect so it fits real nicely in that groove, that when you sand it off, will look real clean like it does here. A couple of different ways to do that. The first is you can actually slide your fence up to within 1/8 of the saw blade and make a cut like that. I'm not real fond of that. There's no real way to get a push stick in there to be able to push that piece through. You certainly can't hope that it will go through by pushing on the opposite side. The second way to do it is to use a scrap block of wood like this with a small foot on one end. Take your fence and slide it over to where that piece of scrap just touches the saw blade, and in effect now that becomes your new 0. So on the fence in the back I can look and see whatever that number is. If I want to cut an 1/8 inch piece, by looking at the fence and moving that 1/8 of an inch, I will now expose an edge that's 1/8 of an inch away from the blade, and by putting my piece of wood in here, pass it forward and cut that off. It does work. One of the problems is that piece passes through the blade, there's no way to hold it in the back, and that little vibration on there can leave some saw marks which may be tough to get off. The third way to do this, and the one I would kind of suggest, is with what's called a thin strip ripping gauge. Now we've had this around for a while and it works just great. The gist of it is, I have a small little ruler underneath this piece of plexiglass and a screw at the other end. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this in the slot. I'm going to adjust my cursor to match 0 on that gauge, and this little brass screw, I'm going to turn it in or back it off until it just touches a left-facing tooth on my saw blade. So when this is set at 0, I know that the edge of this screw is exactly where that saw blade is going to cut. Now if I want to cut an 1/8 of an inch piece of material, all I need to do is move that cursor 1/8 of an inch. So what I've done now is I've moved this screw head 1/8 of an inch away from the saw blade. Here's the material that I want to cut. Using my fence as a gauge, I'm going to slide that until that piece of wood just touches that exposed screw head. And now what I've got is a piece of wood that will have an 1/8 inch left after I make the cut. It's a great way to do it. Let me run it through and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And here's my 1/8 inch piece of wood. It's also another way to add a decorative piece of wood to cover that piece of plywood edge, that exposed plywood edge on a cabinet you're working on. One of the nice parts about this is that all you're going to do is run your material up against the edge and the cut-off piece becomes the part that you glue to the end of the plywood. It's a perfect way to disguise it. If you try and make one of these jigs to cut a thin strip off and you're planning on covering an 8-foot long piece of plywood on the edge, this block has to be 8 feet long. In this case, by using the thin strip ripping gauge, it works just great.